Hi Booktube, and welcome to a new video. This is my version of shout out video. It's not going to be just straight shouting out video. This is more about my debt to Booktube, really. Hence the title of Thank You Booktube. By which I mean, I want to pose a question to all Booktubers and readers for that matter. Is, how do you choose your books to read? So for me, before I'd even heard of Booktube, I was never particularly a browser in bookshops, because when I went into a bookshop I pretty much knew the title of the books I wanted to buy, or if not the title, at least I knew I wanted books by certain writers. So the only browsing element would be, which of their blurbs appeal to me most at that particular time. And I hate the notion of an algorithm of sort of algebraic abstract numbers to choose words. That, to me, that does not compute, literally. But I will admit, algorithms have some value. I think it's too simplistic to sort of say, if you liked this book, you'll love this. But I did last year. I did use the Goodreads because you read this. You might want to consider these. And the reason I did that is because I was reading a certain type of book, difficult fiction, sort of out there fiction. It's kind of hard to sort of pigeonhole it. And it was a sort of short circuit way of finding other titles that were loosely, of that ilk. So it's quite useful. But I'd come to the end of it. I wasn't getting any more interesting recommendations. So that sort of limited use of algorithmic logic sort of had ceased for me last year. And even though I didn't study English literature, the one thing that my university degree gave me was an ability to sort of, work my way around reference systems. So it's really I couldn't explain it, but I know how to sort of follow leads. So I read a book, really liked it. Obviously I would buy more books by that author. But by sort of referencing, I managed to find other books, that was sort of like that. So in a way it's my own sort of Heath Robinson version of the if you liked this, you might like that. So I can't be completely against it. But again, I'd sort of reached the limits of that. I'm not saying I've read every single thing in this reasonably narrow sphere of what I like reading, but I was finding it harder to sort of track down new titles. And then completely coincidentally, I joined Booktube, and all of a sudden my horizons were just, amplified, because now it was no longer me playing detective. I had all these fellow booktubers doing sort of, footwork for, ostensibly on their behalf, but also on my behalf, because I've read 42 books this year, of which 15 are direct recommendations from watching other booktubers' videos. I probably wouldn't have heard of most of them, not all of them exclusively. So, for example, The Early King and the Kid in Yellow by Danny Denton. I never would have heard of this book. It was published this year. First time author. Look at the cover and that would never have attracted me to it because it looks like a YA book. But Viv on Viv's Book Nook talked about this book and really sold it to me. And I'm so glad she did, because for me, this was a 5-star read. I think I talked about it in my April wrap-up video. So, I'm not talking about at length about any of the books today, because this is more about the booktubers who turned me onto the books. But this is the first one, Viv's Book Nook. I'll also say I'm going to put links to every booktuber who I mention. I'm going to put a link to their channel in the description box. My son's back home from university, and this room that I record in is his study, so it's really cluttered with stuff, and I've just knocked down a photo of his. On to the next one, Nutshell, Ian McEwan. Now, I'm very familiar with Ian McEwan. I've read quite a few of his books, but I'd gone off him. I just couldn't be doing with him anymore after the lamentable Solar. But Beth Chat's Books talked about Nutshell, and she reinvigorated my curiosity about McEwan and giving him another chance. And I'm very glad she did, because I think I gave this 4 stars. So Beth Chat's Books, she was spot on, and I absolutely trust her judgment. So that's the second book I've been recommended that I wouldn't have read, although obviously I had heard of it. Well, I say I had heard of it. Obviously I'd heard of Ian McEwan, but because I'd so sort of been turned off by him, I stopped following after On Chesil Beach, which I read, and for me was okay, nothing special. I stopped following, what he was producing. I had no idea this book had even come out. So again, it was only thanks to Beth Chat's books that I became aware of it. I took a punt on it, and she was right. So the next shout out, The Cut, Antony Cartwright, an author who I think is well known, but I'd never heard of him. And this was recommended by Neil Griffiths on his channel, as you'll see of several of the books that we're going to talk about today. And there was a key word in this that sort of piqued my interest, and that was Brexit. This is supposedly the first anti-Brexit. Sorry, I say anti-Brexit. I mean post-Brexit novel. Now, Ali Smith, which I'll come to next, was sort of sold as that as well. But I read this first and decided it had, very little to do with Brexit. So when Neil talked about this, it absolutely sold it to me. Now, it wasn't a great success for me. I think I gave it 3 stars out of 5. But I'm glad I read it because I'm still searching for the first, hard-hitting post-Brexit novel. So I'm very grateful to Neil for alerting me to this book. I had no idea it existed. And, it's easy to say something is sort of, post-Brexit. But, this is from the editor of Perrine Press who published this. Or not only published it, commissioned it. The result of the EU referendum shocked me. I realised that I had been living in one part of a divided country. What fears and what hopes drove my fellow citizens to vote for Brexit? I commissioned Antony Cartwright to build a fictional bridge between the two Britons that have opposed each other since the referendum day. Now, if I was a browser, I might have come across that and I might have read that and it would have had the same effect. Yeah, this is for me. But I'm not a browser. I didn't know this book existed. I didn't know that the editor of an independent press, which basically puts out translated works, translations into English of foreign fiction, had sort of made this sort of statement of intent and commissioned a book specially to execute that. Ali Smith's Autumn. Now, I've heard several people talk about this, but obviously I'd read one Ali Smith book called Hotel World. Didn't particularly do anything for me. I haven't gone back to Ali Smith. But both Kate Armstrong and Curtis Books and Books, or Curtis Films and Books as it was then, he's since changed the name of his channel, both talked about this. And to be fair to both of them, they do mention that it was a post-Brexit book. But, in both of their reviews, they talk about, what the book is so much more than that, and about the characters and what Smith is doing sort of stylistically and thematically. And I actually got it wrong because I thought Winter, which is the second in a quartet of which this is the first, I thought Winter was the post-Brexit book, and I ordered that I got it doubly wrong because this is sort of the post-Brexit one, not Winter. And also Winter is not out in paperback till October, and I'm too cheap to order the hardback. So I ordered Winter first. It didn't arrive. I looked up my orders, saw it wasn't due till October. I thought, I've screwed that up. So I went and bought this one, which it turned out to be the one that is supposedly Brexity. I gave this a 4-star question mark because, as I said in my video on it, it has a dedicated video, that I really need to see the others in the quartet to see how this all fits in and whether I think she's successful in what she's trying to do. But again, I would not have returned to Ali Smith without people like Kate Armstrong and Curtis Books and Books extolling it and inviting me and intriguing me enough that I thought, I'm going to give this a chance. So the next couple of books are from the Man International Booker Prize, which I didn't even know existed. Obviously, I was aware of the Man Booker Prize. I had no idea there was an international prize. I'm not really that sort of clued into prizes. And again, I saw several booktubers talk about the long list when it was published. Probably Eric Carl Anderson at Lonesome Reader. And I obviously now can't remember if they talked about the books or whether I just went away and did research what was on the list. There were 3 books that I'd already read because I read everything by those authors. Lauren Binet's The Seventh Functional Language is one of them. But of the rest that I hadn't read, these were the 2 that appealed to me. Frankenstein in Baghdad and Virginie Despente's Vernon Subutex, Volume 1. And I've done a dedicated video on it, but these are 2 authors I never would have heard of, never would have read, without Booktubers turning me on to the concept that, hey, there's a Man International Booker Prize as well as the Man Booker Prize. And, you know, I thought they were sort of 3.5 star videos. I mean, books. Not particularly mind-blowing, but what I liked about, what was important to me about reading Vernon Subutex is it sort of helped me establish my theory about the state of French literature, which I think is on the upswing, you know, after years in the doldrums. You've got her, you've got Houellebecq, who's obviously been around a long time. You've got Matthias Enard, who's recently emerged on Fitzgerald over the last 2-3 years. And you've got Laurent Binet. And I think French literature is an amazingly strong place. I'm really glad I read this. I mean, I put it as in the sort of the French tradition of the misanthropy. So there's sort of, you know, there's a direct line back to, you know, traditional French novel. Thematically, I mean, you know, she's doing things stylistically here which wouldn't have fitted in with the sort of French tradition of novel writing. But I'm really pleased I read this because it showed me that, as I say, French literature is on the up and up. And this one, you know, it's the first Iraqi book I've ever read, and it was flawed. I mean, the idea of it is genius. And again, I refer you to my review of this together with the Subutex. But very soon after, I saw this, The President's Gardens, by another Iraqi writer, on Simon Savage's channel. Now, I'm not sure whether I should be shouting out to Simon Savage or to Simon Savage's mum, because Simon Savage admitted on that video that it was his mum who turned him onto this. And I read this quite soon after Frankenstein and Baghdad, and this is really far superior. I mean, this was a 4 to 4.5 star read. The only reason I knocked off half a star is because unfortunately it looks like it's going to be a sequel, and I really don't like the idea of sequels. I think you should say everything there is to be said within one volume. But anyway, this was a terrific read. And, you know, between the two of them, you get such a picture of the tragedy of Iraq over the last 20, 30 years. So, you know, thanks to Eric, the Lonesome Reader, for that one, and Simon Savage for that one. And Eric and Simon, if you don't know, are two absolute top dogs in Booktube. And if you're not following them and you like literary fiction, you should do. And I'm posting the links for their channels, and you need to cut and paste. No, in fact, you can click on them automatically, can't you? Duh. And then subscribe to them. Peach by Emma Glass. Now, this was recommended to me by Eric, the Lonesome Reader, again. When he and Anna James, they did a pre-women's fiction prize, drawing up their own long list to see, you know, how many they get right and how many they wouldn't get right. And Eric extolled about this book and made it sound really interesting. Now, I didn't get on with this book. It, you know, as it goes, it's a failure. But I'm glad I read it because it was trying to do something which is in my wheelhouse, which is experimental or, you know, linguistic. It didn't work, but I still feel better for having read it. I think I gave it 2 stars in my April roundup, so you can see a sort of slightly, you know, fuller sort of inquiry as to why I didn't get on with it. But, you know, I'm still grateful that I was alerted to this book. Rachel Cusk, Outline. Now, Rachel Cusk is another one of those authors who I'd read when she first started writing, I think in the early 2000s, and gradually sort of, I think I read 2 or 3 of her books, but they weren't doing anything particularly for me, so I stopped reading her. But obviously I was aware of her name, and I was sort of dimly aware that her name was sort of being mentioned in dispatches with, you know, sort of, this is a very important, it's a trilogy of works, that this was the first that came out 2-3 years ago, and I think all 3 are now out. And it was Curtis Books and Books who turned me onto it. And interestingly, he talked about it in a sort of what am I reading video, but hadn't posted his dedicated video to it. But, you know, he said enough in that book, in that sort of brief thing, plus it's Curtis, whose judgment I absolutely trust 110%, that I went out and bought this on the strength of him even mentioning it, not even going into any detail about it. And ironically, probably because he has more of a life than I do, I actually ended up getting my video on this book out before he did. And as he says, we sort of agree about the same things in how we analyse the book, but he has a positive take in conclusion, whereas mine was quite negative. But it was interesting because we felt very similar in terms of, you know, how the book was put together. And what it was doing, but we had different reactions to that. So I bought this simply on it being mentioned. So it didn't even have a keyword like Brexit or whatever. It was just Curtis mentioning it. Hilda Hist with My Dog Eyes, she's a Brazilian writer. And I was turned on to this by the Bibliotherapist. Now, I've read a couple of Clarice Lispector's books and loved them both. But she was the only Brazilian woman writer that I'd heard of. I'd never heard of this woman. But the Bibliotherapist recently reviewed this book that she'd read. It's very short. I mean, it's literally about 60 pages. And I got in a conversation with her on that, in the comments on that video. I said, right, it sounds right up my street, I'm going to buy it. And I gave this 4 stars. So again, without Bibliotherapist, I never even would have heard of this author. And having read the book, I feel I've only benefited from it. And now I have a second Brazilian female author whose work I'm going to, at some point be a completist about. And finally, on to as far as fiction goes, we have Pond by Claire Louise Bennett. Now, I was aware of this book because this is one of the early ones of Fitzcarraldo editions, and I've read most of the early ones, but this one I kept sticking out because reading the blurb about it just sort of didn't appeal. But Neil Griffiths and someone, one of his sort of regular sort of subscribers, they were talking. Neil did a video on it, and then the regular subscriber to Neil, who's also subscribed to me, sort of said, this is brilliant. So I thought, well, that's 2 votes, and for me it was so. It was about 3.5, but I actually think it was important for me to read this because I keep sort of going on about Fitzcarraldo and how wonderful the early stuff is, and it is. But I was saying that having read it all, and while this doesn't quite hold up to the Doll's Alphabet or Zone or what's Compass by Matthias Enard or Bricks and Mortar by a German author, for me, because of my taste, I didn't get on with this as I got with those. But now I just feel more authoritative that I have read every Fitzcarraldo in the early part of their series, and I feel that I can justifiably talk in a more informed way than before I read this. So I'm not upset that A, I was sort of recommended this book, and B, I didn't quite feel that their recommendation was successful for me. But on another level, it absolutely was. And on to non-fiction. I don't read a lot of non-fiction. I've read more non-fiction this year already in 6 books than the whole of last year. But part of the reason for that is because 3 of those titles have been recommended to me by Booktubers. So these are Oxford's a very short introduction series. Literary theory and contemporary fiction were recommended to me by the Book Chemist. And I read contemporary fiction first, and this was great. I mean, this was such a good, comprehensive in such a short, amount of pages review of contemporary fiction. What are the major themes? What lies behind it? And this was I think it's 4.5 stars for me. This one was less good. This was about 2.5 stars, I think. But I'm really glad I read it because I'm not an academic. I didn't study English literature. I don't really know what literary theory is. And this book, A, served as a very good guide on all the different types, all the different theories in literary theory. Literally a paragraph on each in the appendix. So that was very helpful. But also it sort of affirmed my reasons why I don't feel I need to, dive into literary theory in order to be able to appreciate books. It's sort of rather upheld my own sort of personal, subjective, individual way. But again, I feel I can argue that case more strongly having read this. So even though it was only 2.5 stars as a read, in terms of usefulness, it was probably 4.5. And then finally on the non-fiction, Galen Strawson, Things That Bother Me, recommended by Neil Griffiths. Neil said he's been reading a lot of Strawson recently, and this is my first introduction to him. I'd vaguely heard the name, but I didn't really know anything about him. And the key word that Neil uttered was death. Strawson, in this, amongst many other things, thinks about death, and as one of the things that bother him. And that was enough for me. And this was fantastic. This was, Strawson is 5 stars. I gave the book 4.5 stars because I felt his editor had knocked a star off by the way this had been edited with a couple of sort of bolt-ons and repeated sort of essays, which I felt, didn't really. It was clearly done there to bulk it up in a way that didn't need doing. But I should be forever eternally grateful to Neil for this recommendation, because I don't read a lot of philosophy these days, and And this book really got me thinking about a lot of the themes that it dealt with. And Neil, thank you. So those are the books. Those are the fifth. There's also Happy by Nicola Barker, which I borrowed from a workmate, so I don't have a copy of that. That was recommended by Kate Armstrong, who gave a very full and in-depth review of it, which intrigued me because regular viewers to my channel will know I have a problem with Nicola Barker. And I still do, having read Happy, but I felt it was the most successful of the three of her books that I'd read in terms of doing something innovative with form. It wasn't a great book in terms of plot and character and themes, but the visual stuff she was doing with the look of how language was on the page visually, I thought was very worthwhile. So, Kate Armstrong's review, and she wasn't gushing about it, but she went into enough detail that I could draw out that yes, there was going to be things in this book of value to me, which there were. So, thanks very much to Kate for that. So those are the 15 of the books that I've read this year. So 15 of the 42 books I read have all come from Booktube. And then looking at the next 5 books that I've got lined up to read, all of them are recommendations from Booktube. Every single one. So the one I'm currently reading is Literary Activism, a Symposium, which is... it was a symposium that took place, and writers and publishers and literary critics, maybe literary journalists as well, I don't know about that, met to talk about the concept of literary activism. And this was recommended to me by Cynthia Dubois, who, if you don't subscribe to her, you need to do that when you finish watching my video. Or even, I will give you permission, hit pause, go and look at the link to hers and subscribe, then come back and finish this video. Now, this book isn't actually what I thought it was, because to me, literary activism, I always think, from the point of view of a writer, and it drives me nuts that, there seem to be so few politically active, politically, motivated writers in the UK. Well, that's not what this book's about at all. It's about activism to promote books, to promote literature, both within the marketplace to make any book stand out, to try and, push itself above the parapet to be noticed, which I would hope that any publishing house does for their books and their authors anyway, but clearly they don't because they don't have the budgets for it. But it's not just market activism. It's about restoring or boosting the place that literature has in our societies. What is its place in education, in English language, English literature studies at schools, and how it's sort of slipped down or possibly been dumbed down, whatever you want to call it, and how we need to bring it up, and what is the benefit to a society of doing things like that. It talks about books in translation, the pros and cons, how if everything's just translated into English, there's a sort of, apart from the fact you lose a lot of the, no matter how good the translators are, you lose a lot of the nuance of the original language, but particularly its cultural context can get lost in translation. But also that you just get this sort of, mass standardised English literature where all books have to kowtow and suck at the tit of the English language in order to be read. So there's a lot. I'm only halfway through this, so there's other stuff to come. This has been a brilliant read, even though it's not anything that I imagined it to. So Cynthia, thank you ever so much for that. This is Samuel R. Delaney, Babel 17, part of the Science Fiction Masterworks. This was recommended by Dane Reeds in his one of his shelf tours, his most recent one. Dane has probably 10 to 15 individual shelves to tour, so it's going to take him a long time to get through it. Fortunately, we'd reached the letter D last week when I saw this. Now, I don't read a huge amount of science fiction, but 2 of my all-time favourite 3 titles have they basically look at linguistics, between humans, how humans use language and how alien races use languages. And all Dane had to say to get me was, this does the same. So I haven't read it yet, obviously. I can't wait. This could go into my pantheon of language-based science fiction. So Dane, thank you very much. Never heard of the book, and now I have. A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, Antony Mara. So this was recommended by Sean the Book Maniac when he was doing his Epigrams original tag. He read because I haven't read it yet. I haven't even looked at the epigram since he read it out on his tag. So it's a thing from Tolstoy. It was of this death that I was reminded by the crushed thistle in the midst of the ploughed field. So this is a book basically about Chechnya. And that is, again, a key word for me. You can say Cambodian Chechnya and I will read it. I might even read non-fiction, particularly about Cambodia, if you mention either of those buzzwords. But, you know, a novel set in those countries, I'm there. Again, never, you know, even though I think Antony Mara is quite well known, I'd never heard of him. So thanks to Sean the Book Maniac for pointing me out to this author and this book in particular. The timing of reading this will be determined because I'm going to do it as a buddy read with Curtis Books and Books. And his copy is arriving from Sean the Book Maniac in Japan by snail mail because Curtis won it in Sean's Celebrating 1,000 Subscribers draw. So thanks to Sean. The next one, The Department of Speculation by Jenny Offill. This came out of Eric Lonesome Reader and Anna James's predictions for the Women's Fiction Prize. Not because this book was in contention, because it's already been out a couple of years, but they compared 3 of the books on their list to this book, saying it was very like it. I thought, wow, how influential has this book been to have inspired or influenced 3 other books? So I had to get this. And finally, back to Neil Griffiths, back to non-fiction. Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief by Jordan B. Peterson. Yes, that Jordan B. Peterson. I'm not going to go down that wormhole. He's a naughty boy on Twitter, possibly a dangerous naughty boy. But this was written, a long time preceding all of that hullabaloo, and is about why human beings seem to need story. Why is it so important to our mental maps and how we perceive reality and all of that. So thank you to Neil for turning me on to this. So there you have it, Booktube. 15 out of 42 books read purely on the recommendation or the illumination as to their existence by fellow booktubers. And my next 5 reads, including my current read, all down to fellow booktubers. That will make it 20 out of 47. So I'm incredibly grateful to Booktube for opening and amplifying my horizons, to introducing me to new authors, many of whom have been huge hits. Not all, but I don't think any of those reads are wasted. Even Peach, which I gave two stars to, I think was a valuable exercise for me. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.